They left an 82-year-old man face down in the mud of his own backfield during a September thunderstorm. Not a stranger, his son. The same son who, while paramedics were still scraping Walter Grimes off the wet ground, was sitting in a lawyer's office 3 towns over, signing emergency guardianship papers. The property was 40 acres on Ridgeline Road, $1.2 million. Raymond had already transferred the utilities into his LLC, told the neighbors Walter was in memory care, and started calling developers in Clarksburg. He had searched the house, the filing cabinet, the safe deposit box. He found nothing to stop him. But Hector never left that field. A 14-year-old Labrador, standing in the rain for 6 hours, barking at the road until someone finally stopped. And beneath the oak tree, 18 inches underground, Dorothy had left something Raymond never thought to look for, because he never believed his mother was smarter than him. He was wrong. 34 years in the ground, right where Dorothy left it, right on time. Walter Grimes had lived on Ridgeline Road for 51 years. He had built the back porch himself in 1987, using lumber he'd milled from 2 downed oaks on the north end of the property. The porch was slightly uneven on the left side. Dorothy had pointed it out every summer for 30 years, and every summer Walter had said he would fix it. He never did. After she died, he stopped noticing the unevenness. He started noticing other things instead. He was up every morning at 5:15. Not because an alarm told him to, but because the farm had trained his body over 5 decades to rise before the light did. He would put on the same blue canvas work jacket, the one with the cracked left pocket button that Dorothy had sewn back on 4 times, fill Hector's bowl, and walk the fence line along the east field before the coffee finished brewing. 40 acres, same route, every morning. Hector padding behind him, nose low, unhurried. Walter had a particular habit that his neighbors knew well. He kept a small spiral notebook in his breast pocket, the $3 kind from the hardware store, and he wrote things down. Not feelings, not memories, measurements, fence post spacing, soil moisture notes, the date he last treated the oak tree near the back boundary for bark beetles. He had kept this habit since 1979, and there were 62 of those notebooks in a shoebox on the closet shelf, each one labeled by year in his careful, compressed handwriting. The warning came on a Tuesday in late July. Raymond had driven out unannounced, which itself was unusual, because Raymond rarely came without a reason that benefited Raymond. He walked the property slowly, hands in his pockets, asking questions that sounded casual but landed with a specific weight. How much do you think the Northfield is worth these days? Have you thought about what happens to the place when you're gone? Walter answered him plainly and watched his son's eyes move across the land, the way a man's eyes move across something he has already decided to take. That night, Walter sat at the kitchen table for a long time after dinner. He pulled out his spiral notebook. He did not write measurements. He wrote Raymond's name. Then he sat looking at it. Then he closed the notebook, put it back in his pocket, and called Hector up onto the porch. He did not call a lawyer. He did not call Lily. He told himself he had misread it. He had not misread it. The paperwork arrived on a Friday morning, September 6th, not delivered by Raymond. delivered by a process server named Gary Tillman, who handed Walter a manila envelope at the front door at 8:47 a.m., said, "Have a good day," without making eye contact, and walked back to his car. Walter stood in the doorway, in his blue canvas jacket, Hector pressing against his left leg, and opened the envelope on the porch. It was a petition for emergency conservatorship, filed in Harlan County Family Court 2 days earlier. Raymond Grimes, petitioner. Walter Grimes, respondent. Attached was a 4-page neurological evaluation from a doctor. Preston Hale of Clarksburg Medical Associates, dated August 29th. A doctor Walter had never seen, never spoken to, never sat across from in any room. The evaluation described Walter as displaying moderate to severe cognitive decline, inability to manage financial affairs, and risk of self-harm through neglect. It cited 3 incidents of alleged disorientation, 2 of which Walter had no memory of because they had never happened. The 3rd incident cited was real. 6 months earlier, Walter had driven to the hardware store and returned without the lumber he had gone to buy. He had forgotten it in the loading bay. He had gone back the next morning and retrieved it without incident. Raymond had been visiting that weekend. Raymond had seen it happen. Raymond had written it down. Walter read the document twice, standing on the porch. Then he folded it back into the envelope, set it on the kitchen table, and finished his fence line walk. He needed to think, and he thought best while moving. By noon, he had called 2 people. The first was Dale Whitmore, a retired attorney in Cartersville, who had handled Walter and Dorothy's property filings in the 1980s. Dale was 77, still sharp and deeply unhappy about what he heard. He told Walter not to sign anything, not to speak to Raymond without a witness present, and that he would file a formal objection to the conservatorship petition by Monday morning. The second call was to Lily, Walter's granddaughter, 29 years old, living in Morgantown, who listened to her grandfather's voice and got in her car before he finished the sentence. Lily arrived at Ridgeline Road at 4 p.m. that Friday. She sat across from Walter at the kitchen table, read every page of the petition, and pressed her palms flat on the table surface the way people do when they are trying to keep themselves level. She asked Walter one question. Had he signed anything Raymond had brought him in the past year? Walter said he didn't think so. Lily drove to Raymond's house in Clarksburg that evening. She knocked. Raymond answered. The conversation lasted 9 minutes, and by the end of it, Raymond had told his daughter, calmly, without raising his voice, which was somehow worse than shouting, that Walter was no longer capable of managing 40 acres alone, that the farm was a liability, that this was being handled for Walter's benefit, and that if Lily wanted to be involved, she could speak to his attorney. Then he closed the door. 3 days later, on Monday, September 9th, Raymond's attorney filed a motion to accelerate the conservatorship hearing on grounds of imminent risk. Dale Whitmore filed the objection as promised. The court scheduled a hearing for September 23rd, 14 days away. On the night of September 11th, the storm came in from the northwest. Walter woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of it hitting the roof in long lateral sheets. He lay still for a moment in the dark. Then something moved in him, not panic, not confusion, but something older and more specific, a direction. He got up, put on his jacket and his boots, took the rusted garden trowel from the hook beside the back door, and walked out into the field in the dark and the rain. Hector followed him. They found Walter at 6:17 a.m. at the eastern edge of the backfield, 40 yards from the oak tree, face down in the mud, unconscious, his core temperature at 94.2 degrees. The trowel was still in his right hand. His left hand was buried wrist deep in the ground. In the emergency room at Harlan County General, Dr. Anita Sharma was the attending physician. She was thorough. She noticed things other people moved past. She noticed that the mud compacted beneath Walter's fingernails was not surface clay. It was the darker, denser subsoil that only appears below 12 inches of depth. Walter had not stumbled. Walter had been digging. When her nurse, Patricia Odom, leaned close and asked Walter quietly what he had been looking for, Walter opened his eyes, gripped Patricia's wrist with surprising force, and said clearly, without any tremor in his voice, "Raymond can't have it." Dorothy put it where he'd never look. Then his eyes closed again. Patricia assumed it was the fever talking, "Doctor." Sharma picked up a yellow post-it note from the nurse's station, wrote the words down exactly as spoken, and stuck it to the inside cover of Walter's chart. That post-it note would not stay on that chart for long. Walter spent 3 days in Harlan County General. He did not sleep well in the hospital. The lights in the corridor stayed on all night, and the sounds were wrong. Not the sounds of the farm, not the low settling of the old house, not Hector's breathing from the foot of the bed. He lay in the adjustable bed with the guardrails up and stared at the ceiling tiles. I counted them. There were 47 full tiles visible from where he lay, and 3 partial ones near the window. He counted them twice to make sure. Lily stayed in Cartersville at the Ridgeline Inn, 12 minutes from the hospital, and came every morning at 7. She brought Walter's spiral notebook from the kitchen table on the second day because he had asked for it specifically, and when she handed it to him, he opened it immediately to a blank page and began writing. Not about the conservatorship, not about Raymond. Measurements, fence post spacings, soil notes from the east field, the things that were real and countable in his. On the morning of the 3rd day, Dr. Sharma signed Walter's discharge papers and sat with him for 20 minutes before Lily arrived. She was direct with him in a way that Walter respected. She told him his core temperature had been dangerously low, that at his age a second exposure like that could kill him, and that she needed him to understand that. Walter told her he understood. Then he asked her if she had written down what he'd said when he came in. She told him she had passed it along. Walter nodded and said nothing more about it. But his hand moved to his breast pocket, checking for the spiral notebook, the way a man checks for his wallet when someone mentions theft. Dale Whitmore picked Walter up from the hospital at 11. Lily followed in her own car. They drove to Dale's office in Cartersville, a 2-room setup above the hardware store, the same office where Walter and Dorothy had signed the original property trust paperwork in 1989. The walls still had the same wood paneling. There was a framed photograph of the Cartersville grain elevator on the wall that had been there for at least 20 years. Walter sat down in the same chair he had sat in with Dorothy 34 years earlier and put his hands on his knees. Dale laid out the situation without softening it. The conservatorship hearing was now 12 days away. Raymond's attorney, a Clarksburg firm named Holt and Associates, expensive and well-connected, had submitted Dr. Hale's neurological evaluation as primary evidence. Without a counter-evaluation from an independent neurologist, the court would likely give significant weight to Hale's findings. A counter-evaluation needed to be scheduled, conducted, and documented within 9 days to be included in the pre-hearing submission. Dale had a contact at West Virginia University Medical Center in Morgantown, a doctor, Renata Vasquez, board-certified neurologist, who had testified in 3 prior elder conservatorship cases, and who had, in Dale's words, a very low tolerance for junk science. The second problem was money. Walter's checking account, the joint account he had maintained since Dorothy's death, had been frozen 2 days earlier. Raymond had filed an emergency motion citing financial mismanagement, attaching as evidence 2 large withdrawals Walter had made in the spring. Walter looked at the amounts Dale read aloud, $4 $200 in March and $3 $800 in April. He told Dale immediately what those withdrawals were for. The March withdrawal was for new fencing materials on the north pasture. The April withdrawal was for the bark beetle treatment on the oak trees. He had the receipts. He had written both expenditures in his spiral notebook with the vendor names, dates, and amounts. Dale looked at the notebook for a moment. Then he said, "Walter, that notebook may be the most important thing you own right now." Walter said, "Dorothy always said I wrote too much down." Dale said, "Dorothy was wrong about that one. They had $340 in an accessible savings account in Walter's name alone." Dale waved his retainer. Lily paid for the hotel and the gas. They started from there. Deputy Carla Mendez had been with the Harlan County Sheriff's Department for 11 years. She worked property crime and elder affairs, a combination that, in a rural county with an aging population and a land market that had been heating up for a decade, kept her steadily occupied. She was 38 years old, methodical and deeply unimpressed by paperwork that arrived too quickly after a crisis. It was the timing that bothered her. She had been handed Walter's case file on the morning of September 12th, the day after his hospitalization, because Raymond's attorney had CC'd the sheriff's department on the emergency conservatorship motion as a courtesy. Carla read the motion in full. Then she looked at the timestamp on the original filing, September 6th, 8:31 a.m. The process server had arrived at Walter's door at 8:47 a.m. that same morning. The filing had been submitted 16 minutes before Walter even opened the envelope. She drove to Harlan County General that afternoon to review the intake notes. That was when she found the post-it note on Walter's chart, still there because Patricia Odom had pressed it down firmly, and no one had thought to remove it. Carla photographed it with her phone. Then, she sat in her cruiser in the hospital parking lot and read it 4 times. "Raymond can't have it." Dorothy put it where he'd never look. Carla Mendez had grown up in Harlan County. Her grandmother had owned 12 acres on the south side of the county and had lost them at 71 to a title dispute engineered by a developer who had befriended her for 8 months before producing paperwork she didn't understand. The acreage was now a storage facility. Her grandmother had died in a one-bedroom apartment in Beckley. Carla had thought about those 12 acres and that storage facility more times than she could count. She called Dale Whitmore's office at 4:15 that afternoon. Dale had been expecting someone to call. He had not expected it to be the sheriff's department. From that day forward, Carla Mendez worked Walter's case on her own time. She did not file reports she wasn't required to file. She did not announce what she was looking for. She drove out to Ridgeline Road
on the morning of September 14th, walked the property with Walter's permission, and stood for a long time at the eastern edge of the backfield, looking at the oak tree 40 yards away, thinking about what a man grips a trowel for at 2 in the morning in a thunderstorm.
She did not dig anything up that day. She wasn't ready yet. But she marked the spot in her memory with the precision of someone who had learned that the ground sometimes holds what the paperwork hides. The independent neurological evaluation was scheduled for September 17th at WVU Medical Center in Morgantown, 6 days before the hearing. Lily drove Walter the 2.5 hours north on a Tuesday morning. Walter wore his good shirt, the gray one Dorothy had bought him for their 45th anniversary dinner, and he brought his spiral notebook. Dr. Renata Vasquez was 54, precise, and conducted the evaluation over 3 hours and 20 minutes. She administered the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, the trail-making test, the Ray Auditory Verbal Learning test, and a structured clinical interview. She asked Walter about his daily routines, his property management, his financial decisions. Walter answered every question. When she asked him to describe his property boundaries, he recited them from memory. North line 847 feet, east line at the fence break 412 feet, south boundary running along the creek bed without hesitation. When she asked about the March and April withdrawals, he described both transactions with vendor names, material quantities, and delivery dates. She asked him if he had documentation. He produced the spiral notebook. Dr. Vasquez spent 11 minutes reading that notebook. She read slowly. She turned pages carefully. At the end, she set it down on her desk and looked at Walter steadily. She said, "Mr. Grimes, in my professional opinion, you are oriented to time, place, and financial reality to a degree that many people 30 years younger are not." Walter said, "I've been writing things down since 1979, she said. "Keep doing that." Her formal evaluation, 17 pages, submitted to Dale Whitmore on September 19th, concluded with a direct rebuttal of Dr. Hale's findings, noting the absence of any documented clinical examination in Hale's methodology, the reliance on second-hand incident reports of unknown reliability, and the conflict of interest implicit in a neurologist retained and paid by the conservatorship petitioner. She used the phrase "falls below acceptable clinical standard" twice. Back in Cartersville, the story was moving through the community the way stories move in small towns, not loudly, but completely. People at the Ridgeline Farm Supply had heard about the conservatorship filing. Two of Walter's neighbors, Bill and Connie Frazier, had been approached by Raymond's LLC in August about the possibility of a land consolidation deal on the north boundary. They had declined at the time without fully understanding why. After learning what the conservatorship meant, Bill Frazier drove to Dale Whitmore's office on September 18th and submitted a written statement describing Raymond's approach, the specific acreage discussed, and the price per acre Raymond's representative had quoted, $9,400, well below market value, contingent on the conservatorship being granted. Dale added the statement to the pre-hearing submission without comment. It didn't need comment. The price per acre said everything. Raymond's attorney, a man named Foster Holt, filed a motion to exclude Dr. Vasquez's evaluation on procedural grounds, arguing it had been submitted outside the agreed timeline. Dale Whitmore checked the court rules, found that the submission fell within the allowable window by 1 business day, and filed a 2-paragraph response that said so. The motion was denied. Raymond called Walter on the evening of September 19th. Walter answered. Raymond's voice was the same as it always was, measured, reasonable sounding, constructed. He said he was only trying to help. He said the farm was too much for one man at 82. He said Dorothy would have wanted this. Walter held the phone and listened to all of it. Then he said, Dorothy didn't want this, and you know that. And he hung up. He wrote the time of the call in his spiral notebook. 7:43 p.m. He wrote, Raymond called. Said Dorothy would have wanted this. She would not have. On September 20th, 3 days before the hearing, Foster Holt filed 2 new documents with the court. The first was a supplementary declaration from Raymond describing a specific incident from July in which Walter had allegedly left the barn door open overnight, allowing 2 of his remaining chickens to escape into the road, where one was struck by a vehicle. Raymond described this as evidence of deteriorating situational awareness and inability to manage basic property responsibilities. He had a photograph of the dead chicken attached as Exhibit C. The second document was a title search report on the Ridgeland Road property submitted, Raymond's attorney argued, to establish the asset value at stake in the conservatorship. The title search had been conducted by a firm connected to Raymond's LLC. It showed the property deed in Walter's name. It showed no trust encumbrance. It showed no prior designation of beneficiary. Because the 1989 trust document was not in any filing cabinet. It was not in the safe deposit box. It was not in Dale Whitmore's records, because Walter and Dorothy had executed it with a different notary, a man named Herbert Sykes, who had retired in 1997 and whose records had never been digitized. Raymond's title search had found nothing because there was nothing above ground to find. Dale Whitmore looked at the title search report on the morning of September 20th and felt, for the first time in the case, genuinely afraid. Without a recorded trust document, without evidence of a prior beneficiary designation, the conservatorship had a clear path to approval. And once Raymond held conservatorship, the property transfer to his LLC could be completed within 60 days under West Virginia statute. He called Lily. Lily drove back to Cartersville from Morgantown that same afternoon. She sat with Walter at the kitchen table and asked him carefully whether he had any memory of documents Dorothy had kept separately from the filing cabinet, anything she might have stored outside the house. Walter sat with the question for a long time. He looked at his hands. He looked out the kitchen window toward the back field. Something moved across his face, not confusion, but the specific effort of a man reaching for something at the edge of his recall, something that had been there all along but had been sitting in shadow. He said she had a canister, military, green, said it was her father's. Lily said, where did she keep it? Walter looked out the window again. His eyes moved to the oak tree at the far edge of the field. He said nothing for almost a full minute. Then he said, she loved that tree. Carla Mendez received the call from Lily at 6:48 p.m. on September 20th. She listened to everything Lily said without interrupting. When Lily finished, Carla was quiet for 4 seconds. Then she said, I need to make one call. I'll be at the property by 8 tomorrow morning.
The call she made was to a man named Sergeant Troy Adkins, K-9 Unit, Harlan County Sheriff's Department, who had been Carla's training partner 11 years earlier and who owed her, by her count, a considerable number of favors.
She did not explain the full situation to Troy. She told him she needed a dog that was good at finding things that had been buried, and she needed him to not ask too many questions about why it wasn't an official search. Troy arrived at Ridgeline Road at 7:55 a.m. on September 21st with his German Shepherd, a 7-year-old male named Sargent. Walter was on the porch when they pulled in. Hector was beside him. Hector watched Sargent with the calm, faintly superior patience of a dog who already knew where they were going. They walked the back field. Sargent worked the perimeter, back and forth, nose down. Hector walked alongside Walter, slowly, stiffly, his bad hips rolling with each step. And when they reached the eastern edge of the field and the shadow of the oak tree fell across the grass, Hector stopped. He had stopped in this exact spot 10,000 times over 11 years. He stopped now the way he always stopped, with the quiet authority of a creature who understands where things belong and where they are kept. Sargent moved to the base of the tree. His behavior changed immediately. His tail went rigid. He sat. Troy looked at Carla. Carla looked at Walter. Walter said, that's the spot. Troy produced a folding spade from his kit bag. He dug carefully, measuring his depth, moving the soil aside in clean layers. At 16 inches, the spade took something solid with a sound that was not stone. He cleared around it with his hands. The top of the canister appeared first. Olive green, military issue, the lid seal still intact after 34 years in the ground. Walter stood over the hole and looked at it for a long moment without speaking. Then he crouched down, slowly, Carla's hand on his arm for balance, and he put both hands on the canister and lifted it out of the ground himself. The seal broke with a clean, dry pop. Inside, wrapped in a layer of wax paper, were 2 documents. The first was the property trust. 4 pages, handwritten, signed by Walter and Dorothy Grimes, notarized by Herbert Sykes on March 14, 1989. Designating the 40-acre Ridgeline Road property as an irrevocable living trust in Walter's name, with Lily Grimes listed as sole beneficiary. The document was valid, the notarization was valid, the trust was real. The second document was 1 page, handwritten. Dorothy's handwriting, the careful, slightly left leaning script that Walter had been reading for 53 years. It was dated October 3rd, 2019, 14 days before Dorothy died. Carla read it aloud because Walter's hands had begun to shake too much to hold the paper steady. Dorothy had written that she was hiding the trust because she was afraid Raymond would destroy it. She wrote that in the spring of 2019, she had found a document in Raymond's car, a blank power of attorney form, pre-signed with Walter's name in Walter's handwriting, on a form dated 2 months before Walter had any diagnosis of cognitive decline. She wrote that she had confronted Raymond about it and that he had told her she was confused. She wrote that she knew she was dying and that she could not protect the property from her hospital bed. She wrote, "I am putting this where Raymond will never think to look, because he has never once in his life been interested in what grows in the ground. He has only ever been interested in what the ground is worth." And she wrote at the bottom of the page, in larger letters than the rest, "This did not begin with Walter forgetting. This began with Raymond deciding there is a difference, and I need someone to know it." Nobody spoke for almost a full minute. Then Walter, still crouched beside the open hole in the ground, put one hand on the oak tree to steady himself and looked up at the sky the way a man looks up when he is trying to keep something from spilling over. Carla bagged both documents as evidence. She called the Harlan County Courthouse at 9:15 a.m. and requested an emergency appointment with Judge Marion Ellery, who was presiding over the conservatorship case. She cited newly discovered material evidence and a potential criminal fraud matter. The appointment was granted for 2 p.m. Foster Holt was not expecting Deputy Mendez at the 2 p.m. session. He was not expecting the trust document. He was not expecting Dorothy's letter. He sat at the respondent's table and read both documents with the expression of a man watching a structure he has built very carefully come apart at a single bolt. Judge Marion Ellery read Dorothy's letter twice. She was a 61-year-old jurist who had been on the Harlan County Family Court bench for 19 years and who had, in that time, developed a considerable capacity for recognizing the architecture of elder financial abuse. She recognized it here. She set Dorothy's letter down on her bench with the deliberateness of someone placing something fragile or something important, and looked at Foster Holt over her reading glasses. She asked him one question, "Mr. Holt, was your client aware of the existence of this trust document at the time he filed the conservatorship petition?" Holt said he could not speak to his client's knowledge. The judge said, "I expect you'll be speaking to it shortly." She suspended the conservatorship hearing on the spot. She ordered the freeze on Walter's bank account lifted within 24 hours. She referred the fraudulent power of attorney document, the pre-signed blank form Dorothy had described, for criminal investigation by the Harlan County Prosecutor's Office. She noted for the record that Dr. Preston Hale's evaluation would be referred to the West Virginia Board of Medicine for a review of methodology and potential ethics violations. Raymond's LLC had, that morning, already sent a preliminary development proposal to the Clarksburg developer. The proposal included a site survey, a projected demolition timeline for the farmhouse, and a rendering of the storage facility that would replace it. The LLC's attorney received the court's suspension order at 3:47 p.m. He called Raymond at 3:51 p.m. Raymond did not answer. Walter drove back to Ridgeline Road that evening with Lily and Dale Whitmore. The porch light was on. Lily had left it on that morning before they drove to the courthouse. Walter climbed the three porch steps, sat down in his chair, and Hector climbed up beside him and put his head in Walter's lap. Walter's hand moved to the dog's ears the way it had moved 10,000 times before, slow and steady and certain. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out his spiral notebook. He opened it to a fresh page. He wrote the date. September 21st. He wrote, "Canister recovered, trust document intact." Dorothy was right. Then he wrote, "Hector knew where it was the whole time." He closed the notebook and sat in the chair until the sun went down. The 2 weeks that followed the suspension of the conservatorship hearing moved differently than the weeks before them. Before, time had been compressing, each day narrowing toward the hearing date like water funneling toward a drain. Now it expanded. There was room again. Walter noticed it the way you notice a headache only after it stops. He was back on his fence line walk by September 23rd. The same route, the same blue canvas jacket. Hector behind him, nose low, unhurried. The east field was still muddy from the September storm, and Walter's boots left deep prints in the soft ground along the boundary. He walked slowly and looked at everything with the particular attention of a man who has recently been reminded that what he is looking at could have been taken from him. He stopped at the oak tree on the way back. The ground had been filled in and tamped down where Troy Adkins had dug. Walter crouched beside it and pressed his palm flat against the soil for a moment. Then he stood up and kept walking. Dale Whitmore filed the trust document with the Harlan County Property Records Office on September 24th. The filing took 11 minutes. The clerk, a woman named Sandra Pruitt, who had worked in that office for 22 years, stamped the document, logged it into the system, and handed Dale his copy. Dale drove directly to Ridgeline Road and handed the copy to Walter. Walter read it once, folded it precisely along its original crease lines, and placed it in his spiral notebook between 2 pages of fence measurements. He did not frame it yet. He was not finished yet. The criminal referral moved faster than Dale had expected. The Harlan County Prosecutor's Office, led by a woman named District Attorney Clara Hobbs, who had built her career on financial fraud cases and who had been watching the county's land market with professional suspicion for 3 years, opened a formal investigation within 72 hours of Judge Ellery's referral. Investigators subpoenaed Raymond's LLC financial records, his personal bank accounts, and the records of Holt and Associates. What I think it's the first week of October, confirmed the shape Dorothy had drawn on her letter, and then exceeded it. The pre-signed power of attorney form was not the only one. There were 3 others. 2 of them already used, backdated to periods predating Walter's cognitive evaluation, used to authorize transfers of a small brokerage account and a life insurance policy supplement that Walter had not known were gone. The total amount moved through those documents was $67,400. Raymond had not spent it all. He had moved it into a holding account inside his LLC, where it sat beneath 2 layers of corporate structure, waiting for the conservatorship to complete the larger transaction. D.A. Hobbs presented her preliminary findings to a grand jury on October 14th. The grand jury returned indictments on 3 counts: elder financial exploitation, forgery of a legal instrument, and wire fraud. A 4th count, Conspiracy was added 6 days later when investigators established that Dr. Preston Hale had been paid $8,500 in cash by Raymond personally, outside of any formal retainer or agreement. 4 days before the neurological evaluation was conducted, Dr. Hale's medical license was suspended pending investigation the same week. He did not contest the suspension. Foster Holt withdrew from Raymond's case on October 9th, citing a conflict of interest he declined to specify publicly. Raymond retained a public defender, which told its own story about what the LLC's accounts looked like once the prosecutors were done examining them. In Cartersville, the story had fully surfaced by early October. It moved through the community not as gossip, but as something more serious. The kind of story that makes people think about their own parents, their own properties, their own filing cabinets. Bill and Connie Frazier, who had submitted the statement about Raymond's lowball land offer, drove out to Ridgeline Road on October 5th with a casserole dish and stayed for 2 hours. 3 other neighbors came that week. The woman who ran the Ridgeline Farm Supply, a 60-year-old named Patty Howell, put a handwritten note in her store window that said simply, "Walter Grimes's farm is staying right where it is." She did not ask anyone's permission to put it there. Carla Mendez stopped by on a Thursday evening in mid-October. She sat on the porch with Walter and drank coffee and did not talk about the case much. She talked about her grandmother's 12 acres. Walter listened to all of it. When she finished, he said, "I'm sorry about the 12 acres." She said, "I know." They sat for a while in the kind of silence that doesn't need filling. Before she left, Carla handed Walter a folded piece of paper. It was a photograph, printed from her phone, slightly grainy, of Hector standing at the base of the oak tree, taken on the morning of September 21st, just before Troy Adkins had started digging. Hector was standing perfectly still, looking directly at the camera, his graying muzzle level, his expression carrying the specific dignity of an old dog who has just done something important and knows it. Walter looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his spiral notebook. Lily came back to Ridgeline Road on October 18th, not for a court date, not for a crisis, but because she had a conversation she needed to have with her grandfather face to face. She sat across from him at the kitchen table, the same table where she had pressed her palms flat and read the conservatorship petition 6 weeks earlier. And she asked him what he wanted the farm to look like in 5 years. Walter considered the question with the same seriousness he gave to fence measurements. He talked for 20 minutes. He talked about the north field, which needed reseeding. He talked about the barn roof, which had been patched twice and needed proper replacement. He talked about the oak tree and how he wanted to put a bench near it in the spring. And then, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned that the barn itself was structurally sound. "Good bones," he said. "The way people say it about houses they love." And that it had been empty since he sold his last 3 cattle in 2021, and that he had not figured out what to do with it. Lily said, "I have an idea about the barn." She had been making ceramics since she was 19, wheel-thrown pottery, functional ware, the kind of thing that sells steadily at craft markets and through small online shops. She had been working out of a rented studio space in Morgantown that cost her $680 a month. She had more orders than she could fill in that space. She had been thinking, she told Walter, about a larger kiln. Walter looked at her across the table. He said, "The barn has good light on the east side in the mornings." Lily said, "I know. I used to sit in there when I was little." They drafted the lease agreement on a legal pad at the kitchen table that evening, Walter writing it out in his compressed, careful handwriting, Lily reading each line back to him. The terms were modest and fair and entirely between them, with no LLC involved and no developer copied and no attorney present, which was exactly the point. Walter signed it. Lily signed it. Walter tore the page from the legal pad, folded it once, and put it in his spiral notebook alongside the trust document and Dorothy's letter and the photograph of Hector at the oak tree. Raymond's arraignment was scheduled for November 4th. The conservatorship petition had been formally dismissed on October 2nd. The $67,400 recovery was proceeding through civil asset forfeiture. Walter's frozen bank account had been restored with interest. Raymond had not called again after the September 19th phone call. He had not come to the property. He had not sent a message through anyone. The silence from that direction was total, and Walter did not fill it. He had said what he needed to say on September 19th, and he had been right, and that was enough for now. The barn conversion began on October 28th. Lily drove down from Morgantown with a rented trailer carrying the smaller of her 2 kilns and 14 boxes of clay. Walter helped her carry the boxes in from the trailer, one at a time, slowly, because his hip was still tender from the fall in the storm. He did not let Lily carry more than him. She did not argue about it. By the time they finished unloading, the light in the barn had shifted to the low gold of late afternoon, falling in long rectangles through the east-facing windows. Lily stood in the middle of the barn floor and looked at the light. Walter stood beside her and looked at it too. He said,
"You always said barn
had good bones." Lily said, "She was right." Walter said, "She usually was." Raymond Grimes's arraignment was held on November 4th at the Harlan County Courthouse, courtroom 2 at 9 in the morning. Walter did not go. He had been asked by D.A. Hobbs's office whether he wished to attend, and he had thought about it for one full day before calling back and saying no. He said he had a fence section on the north boundary that needed attention before the first hard frost, and that he intended to see to it that morning. D.A. Hobbs said she understood. She did not press him. Lily went. She sat in the third row on the left side, with Carla Mendez beside her. She wore the same gray coat she had driven down in 6 weeks earlier, the night she had knocked on Raymond's door for 9 minutes and been told to speak to his attorney. Raymond arrived with his public defender, a young man named Kevin Marsh, who carried his briefcase with both hands and looked as though he had recently stopped sleeping well. Raymond wore a dark blue jacket and kept his eyes forward. He looked, Lily would later tell Walter, like a man who had decided that the correct expression for the occasion was no expression at all. Judge Ellery was not presiding over the arraignment. That fell to a different judge, a man named Judge Carl Reeves. But Judge Ellery had submitted a 4-page written statement to the prosecutor's office detailing her observations from the conservatorship proceedings, and D.A. Hobbs had entered it into the record. It was by any reading a document with opinions. Raymond entered pleas of not guilty on all counts. His bail was set at $85,000. His passport was surrendered. His LLC's remaining assets were frozen pending the civil recovery proceedings. The hearing lasted 22 minutes. On the way out of the courthouse, a local reporter named James Tipton from the Cartersville Courier asked Lily if she had a statement. Lily stopped walking and thought for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said,
"My grandmother buried the truth under a tree because she knew her son would never look for it there."
She was right, and she protected my grandfather from her deathbed. That's the statement. James Tipton printed it verbatim on the front page of the following Thursday's edition, below a photograph of Ridgeline Road taken from the gate at the property entrance, the oak tree visible in the background of the frame. The moment that Walter had been moving toward, not the arraignment, not the legal filings, not the asset recovery, but the real and private moment of confrontation, came 11 days later, on November 15th at Ridgeline Road. Raymond came alone. No attorney, no notice. He pulled into the gravel drive at 2 in the afternoon in his silver pickup and sat in the truck for 4 minutes before getting out. Walter was on the porch. He had seen the truck turn off the road and had not moved from his chair. Hector raised his head, looked at the truck, and put his head back down. Raymond walked to the foot of the porch steps and stopped. He did not come up the steps. Walter did not invite him to. They looked at each other across 3 wooden steps and 50 years of history. Raymond said, "I didn't think it would go this far." Walter said, "I know you didn't." Raymond said, "I thought," and then stopped. He looked at the framed deed beside the front door. It had been mounted there 2 weeks earlier, the court-restored document in a plain oak frame that Walter had made himself in the barn. Raymond looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked back at his father. He said, "I thought the farm was wasted on you, just sitting here." Walter let that land. He did not rush past it. He sat with it the way he sat with hard soil readings in his notebook, noting it, turning it over, understanding what it meant without needing to argue with it. Then he said, "Your mother planted that oak tree the year you turned 3. She hauled the water out to it herself every dry week for 2 summers until the roots took. She did it because she wanted something to still be standing when we were gone." He paused. "It's still standing." Raymond looked at the oak tree at the far edge of the field. His jaw moved once. Walter said, "I'm not going to tell you what kind of man that makes you. You know what kind of man it makes you. What I'll tell you is this: you are not welcome on this property. Not today, not for the trial, not after. The court will handle what the court handles. But this land is not yours, and it never was. And I need you to understand that I am not confused about that." Raymond stood at the foot of those steps for another moment. Then he turned, walked back to the silver pickup, and drove off the property. Walter watched the truck until it was gone from the road. Then he reached into his breast pocket, pulled out his spiral notebook, and opened it to a fresh page. He wrote the date. He wrote, "Raymond came." I said what needed saying. He left. Then he wrote one more line beneath it. The tree is still standing. He closed the notebook. Hector put his head back in Walter's lap. The afternoon light moved across the field the way it always had, slow and golden and indifferent to everything that had just happened and everything that hadn't. Winter came to Ridgeline Road the way it always had, quietly at first, then all at once. The north field went pale and still. The fence line Walter had repaired before the first frost held clean against the cold. The oak tree dropped its last leaves in early November and stood bare and certain against the gray sky, its roots undisturbed, going as deep as they had always gone. Lily moved her larger kiln down from Morgantown in December. She built a wood-burning insert into the barn's east wall and strung warm lights along the ceiling beams the way Dorothy had once strung them along the back porch every Christmas. On the first morning the studio was fully operational. Walter walked out to the barn at 5:45, while the coffee was still brewing, and stood in the open doorway, watching Lily center clay on the wheel. She did not hear him come in. He stood there for a minute, in his blue canvas jacket, the cracked left pocket button still unrepaired, still unremarkable, and watched his granddaughter's hands shape something from nothing, and then walked back to the house without saying a word. The sign went up on the barn door in January. Lily had made it herself. A ceramic tile, hand-lettered, fired in her own kiln. It said, Grimes Studio, Ridgeline Road. Walter had just suggested she had the road name. He said it mattered that people knew where to find it. On a Tuesday morning in late January, Walter did his fence line walk in 2 inches of fresh snow, same route, same jacket. Hector moved slower now in the cold, his bad hips stiffening in this low temperature, but he went the whole way. At the oak tree, Walter stopped. He pressed his hand against the bark the way he had done in September, then straightened up and looked out across the white field toward the barn, where the light in the east-facing windows was already on. He pulled out his spiral notebook. He wrote the date. He wrote the temperature. He wrote the snow depth. He wrote. Hector made the full walk. Then he put the notebook back in his pocket and stood in the snow beside the tree Dorothy had planted, on the land that was his, in the morning that was still and bright and entirely his own. He had nowhere else to be.